Okay, well, hi everyone. And yeah, thank you so much for tuning in and choosing to spend the next hour with us for our webinar, Don't Hate, Automate, the Fundamentals of Automations. So my name is Holly Coxon and I'm a technical support team lead for the FME Server product. And today I'm joined by Sinai, who I'll let introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name's Sinai. I'm a technical support specialist on the FME Server team. Excited to be here.
And we are also joined by Kezia behind the scenes, who is another member of our FME Server support team on hand to aid with the Q&A panel today. So I think at this time, we're just going to turn off our videos so that there's no lag. And we'll turn these back on for the live Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Okay, so before we dive into today's topic, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce the entire FME platform to make sure that we are all on the same page. So first of all, we have our FME Desktop application, and this is really the foundation of the FME platform. It is where all the authoring of transformation workflows takes place. And as the name suggests, this application is accessible on your local desktop and is a graphical drag and drop interface where you can connect readers, writers, and transformers to load, manipulate, analyze data, and so much more. And then we have our FME Server application. And this takes these transformation workflows and allows you to incorporate them into more complex integration tasks. For example, creating self-service applications where the end user can upload or download data, chaining multiple workspaces to run in parallel or in sequence, or setting up workspaces to run in response to an event happening on another application, or taking further downstream actions once a workspace has completed successfully. So then FME Cloud is FME Server, but hosted by Save Software. So you get the same functionality, but with less overall maintenance. And finally, we have our FME Mobile application, but we won't really be touching on that today. So today we'll be walking through the fundamentals of automations, and this functionality is available to FME Server, hosted both on-premise or by FME Cloud. So now that I've provided a brief overview of the platform, I just wanted to take a quick poll to gauge everyone's experience with the FME platform. And if you feel like you don't fit nicely into any of these topics, then please leave a comment through the questions panel as well. So we'll just give a moment or so to complete that poll, and then we'll check out the results.
Okay, and it looks like the majority of people have voted, so I will go ahead and close that poll and share the results in a minute here.
Great. Okay, perfect. So we have a whole host of different experience with the FME platform today. So if you did answer D, then I suspect you are already familiar with a lot of the content that we will be covering in today's session. But of course, we still encourage you to stick around. Okay, let's dive into it. So we're going to start by walking you through why you should care about enterprise integration and how this can be applied in the context of FME Server by making use of automations. So automations is a fairly new feature, but it has a long history. So before we dive into the specifics, we'd like to start by providing some extra background information on where this feature started. Next, we'll be breaking down automations into its individual components and go through everything you need to know to get started. That's not a typo, that's our first pizza-related pun of the session. And then before we wrap up, we'll briefly touch on some advanced functionality, share some resources, and we'll be sure to leave time at the end for a Q&A session as well. But don't forget to please ask any questions that you have throughout. As I mentioned, we'll have Kezia on Q&A, and Sanai and I will also be monitoring this panel when we can as well. So firstly, why should your organization care about adding automated elements into their workloads? Well, there are many advantages to automation that make it a necessity to scale your business to meet growing demands. First of all, it's a huge time saver. This point is really twofold, as not only does it scratch off a task from your personal workload, giving you back time in your day, but in general, adding in automation increases efficiency and productivity, so any tasks will likely be completed in a quicker time frame than they were previously as well. Standardizing processes also alleviates the possibility of introducing human error and makes projects easier to scale up. And then on top of all this, your organization will likely be saving money and improving the experience for the end user. So if you are interested in reading a bit more about automation for the enterprise, then I'll ask Elizabeth to just share out the blog post that is linked on this slide, where we have highlighted some stories from customers who have benefited from one or many of these points. So FME Server is the tool for all things automation, and this is where we'll be focusing our presentation today. So the key functionality that's also rightfully named automations provides a visual drag and drop interface, much like that of FME Desktop, that allows you to build workflows to initiate workspaces to run in response to various events. So for the sake of this webinar, we are assuming that you may have worked with FME Desktop before and that you've created a couple of workspaces, and now you're wondering how to set them up either at a recurring interval or in response to an external event. Perhaps you want them to be run in real time, or perhaps you're looking to chain a series of workspaces together to run either in sequence or in parallel. And if the answer to any of these is yes, then this is where FME Server Automations comes into play. So automations have a long history, and we can actually date the foundations back to 10 years ago in FME Server 2012. So in 2012, a brand new concept was developed for FME Server under the name notifications. And this was the first real-time support for processing workspaces. At that time, we were able to work with email, JMS, and UDP, just to name a few. Over the years, the team worked hard to continually add support for more protocols so that workspaces could be initiated in response to many different events. For example, adding a file to a Dropbox or an S3 bucket, monitoring a WebSocket. However, the notifications configuration was not exactly user-friendly, so you were required to set up 3 different steps across 3 pages of the FME Server web interface, and then these were all presented in a list view, so it was challenging to figure out how everything was connected. So this is where the idea for automations really came from. To give you the best experience possible, we took the selling points from FME Workbench and applied them to this feature. So in 2019, we released this brand new interface, providing a visually appetizing graphical canvas where you could connect related nodes. The aim was to enhance the user experience by building off of the existing notifications functionality. And since then, we've continued to add support for even more advanced enterprise integration workflows. So it's important to be aware of this history because although notifications is now considered legacy functionality, it does remain in the product for backwards compatibility. So if you come across this either in the product or in our knowledge base materials, then don't be confused, but stick to using automations for all of your job orchestration tasks. So now I'm going to hand over to Sanai to walk you through the fundamentals of automations.
Thanks, Holly. So now that we've arrived at present day automations, let's start talking about the fundamentals or the need to know. And to help us do that, we're going to talk about pizza. So stay with us. Let's imagine that the FME lizard has a craving for pizza. So he calls up the restaurant and places an order. Zipster Pizza receives this order, assembles the ingredients, makes the pizza, and finally delivers the pizza to the lizard. The best possible end result is the lizard enjoying the pizza at home. But any step of the way, we can run into issues. And I'm sure at this point, some of you might be checking what webinar you signed up for here. So I'll explain. This pizza story is meant to represent how automations work in FME Server. So in technical terms, the FME lizard is the client that makes a request from the Zipster restaurant, which is the FME Server automation. The ingredients, baking, and delivery are the data and processes that take place inside of an automation. We're going to use this pizza story analogy as we walk through each basic automation component. And we will begin with the client. So our first step in any pizza story is the client. And in this case, there is a lizard who wants to order and receive a pizza. They could technically send this pizza to another client, maybe a friend or a work party. But either way, there's going to be a client on either end of this workflow sending and receiving information. And all automation workflows are initiated by a client. So this is usually a request or an event performed by an end user. So that could be a row update in a database, a file uploaded to a folder, or maybe an email is being sent. Clients can look also a little bit more like applications or systems. So this could be a sensor or satellite that's monitoring or observing something, sending messages about certain events. Either way, automated workflows aren't random. They're always initiated by some event that we're interested in. And any outputs or messages can also be returned to a client, either the same one or a different one. And a trigger is what we use in an automation to receive messages about these events. So I'm sad to say that we can't just manifest pizza. We need to find a way to let the restaurant know that we want a pizza. So we could phone them, use a web form, text them, maybe use a delivery service like Uber Eats or Skip the Dishes. It's all going to go to the same restaurant. And just the same, automations can't read minds yet. FME Server can receive messages from clients in many different ways, however, and this will initiate a workflow. And inside of our automations, we can set up triggers to listen for messages and events coming from clients. The different ways of ordering pizza are all representing different protocols in client-server communication, and protocols are just ways that applications can send messages to each other. And each event, trigger event type represent a different protocol that a client can use to make this request. Here are some of the many different protocols that triggers support, and there are more. So we have cloud services, different types of directories, webhooks, JMS, SQS schedules. So say we want to begin a workflow, every time we get a new email to our Outlook inbox, we choose the email trigger. And the best part about this is we don't need to know the ins and outs of IMAP protocol. I definitely don't still. All we have to know is our basic account information that we'd use to log in to our email in the browser, and we enter that into the trigger. This is a lot like how readers work in FME Workbench. We just add the data to our canvas, and readers make any data set easy to work with, no matter how complex that format actually is. And once our automation is running, triggers are always in an active state. They're listening for messages related to these events for you. They're basically a 24/7, 365 restaurant ready to make pizza at the drop of a hat. So let's get into Server and set up a trigger for the first time. So here we are on the FME Server homepage, and on our side menu are all the things that we can do as a user. Under automations, we have a couple of options, and one of them you might notice is the notifications tab, which is the legacy system that Holly touched on earlier. Unless you're curious about this or already using it, just ignore it. The place we always begin for a new automation is the Build Automation page. And now that we've arrived here, if you're familiar with FME Workbench, you'll be familiar with this idea of a canvas. This is the space where we can build our automation workflows. It's also a drag and drop interface where we can connect workflow components together. And just like we begin our desktop workflows with a reader or creator, we can begin our automation workflows with a trigger. And as we now know, these triggers can be configured for many different types of protocols, which we find in this menu. And many you'll recognize from our protocol slide. For our example, let's use our trusty DirectoryWatch trigger. This one gets used a lot. And once we select it, we can configure parameters to look for certain events. So in this case, we want to choose a folder to watch. And watch triggers can connect to folders on the same system, on a network path, or on some hosted service. But in this case, we're just going to use a folder on our server share. We have other options we can configure. We just want to look for new files incoming. So I'll deselect modified and deleted files. And then we want a very short pull interval here, so we don't have all day. After setting up settings, I can validate it to make sure server is able to access it, and then I just select apply. It's as easy as that. And for this part of the demo, we want to just make sure that our trigger is working. So what I'm going to do is add a log action to our canvas. Like the Workbench logger, we can record messages inside the automation. We'll talk more about these messages later. For now, I just want to send some event data from our DirectoryWatch trigger. So I'll set up the message to do that. And then I'll save this automation. And once I hit start, this automation is now running, and we can drop a file into the directory that we've set it up to watch. So I'll go to that directory. And in this case, I'm going to drop in a zip file containing a shapefile and its sidecar files. So now that this file is dropped into our directory, we can go back to our automation. And our trigger should receive events for each file that's created in that folder. And our logger will record information sent about that event. Okay, awesome. Here we can see that our trigger has successfully gone off and our logger has recorded the message. In this message here, it's the raw message, so we can get our zip file name out of there and path, the time of creation, and any other data about that event that we might be interested in. Now we can take this information and use it to kick off an automated workflow. So let's return back to our slides and figure out what steps we can do next, besides just logging a message. So actions represent any steps that we take after a trigger is fired. And in this point in our pizza story, the restaurant has received our order. Now it's time for the kitchen to make the pizza. And then a driver takes that pizza and delivers it to our door. And this conveniently also describes two categories of actions that we can use in automations. When an event is sent to our trigger, we can perform actions either within FME Server or external to FME Server. So starting with what we can do inside of a kitchen, this would be things like slicing pepperoni, kneading dough, putting it in the oven. We're creating the product here. And internal actions are what we use inside of an automation to process data and messages just like this. Primarily, we're going to be using the run workspace a lot of the time, the run workspace action, that is. So we can build workspaces in desktop, upload them to FME Server, and in FME Server, we can use them to run data transformations within our automated workflows. So within that workspace, you can take that data and do anything you'd like with it. Other internal actions are things like the merge or filter action. These are useful for orchestrating just how these automated workflows are run and any decision making that we'd like to build in. After the pizza is ready, we need to deliver it. So this would be a driver using a car, a bike, walking, any way to bring the pizza to your front door. And many of the same protocols that we use to receive event data from clients, we can also use to deliver data back to our clients. And we can configure these external actions very similarly to trigger events. We just add in our basic information, and the automation will be connected to an external client. External actions are the best way to integrate and connect with other applications. So this might look like sending a notification out upon delivery or failure of a job, uploading data to a file share. This part of the workflow is entirely up to you. And here's another summary page just of all the available protocols for internal and external actions. You can compare all of the actions in this slide to transformers that you might use in Workbench. So for example, you might use a filter transform or a filter action, and that acts a lot like a tester transformer that you'd use on desktop. Or sometimes external actions can also look more like a writer. So if you're uploading data somewhere, that could look like writing out a file. This analogy kind of extends between the two platforms. The distinction between desktop and server actions can become even more blurred when you consider that a lot of these protocols have an equivalent transformer in FME Desktop. So the FTP action is a lot like an FTP caller. We also have a Dropbox connector transformer, S3 connector, and we have a Dropbox external action and an S3 external action, as well as emailer. But there are advantages to using external actions instead of Workspace transformer. For one, actions aren't going to take up engines, so they're lighter on your system resources. I'd also say that breaking up the workflow into these defined sections is often just considered a best practice. It's easier to organize a workflow, troubleshoot, and build in the logic all in one place. So let's jump back into our demo and see what it looks like to use actions. So we first need to stop an automation in order to edit it. And I'm going to click on our log action here, and we'd like to switch it to run a workspace action. And this particular workspace that I've uploaded to server is called building updates, and it's just designed to update a feature service in ArcGIS Online with incoming features. So we have one parameter for it, and all I'm going to do here is enter the path to our newly dropped zip file detected by our DirectoryWatch trigger and select apply. You might notice that workspaces are another way that we can communicate with external clients from an automation that aren't necessarily listed in those protocols. So in this case, we are sending updates to ArcGIS Online. So when you consider all of the transformers, web connections, readers, and writers available to us on desktop, the number of external clients that we can communicate from an automation is practically infinite. So technically with workspaces, we're not even limited to these external actions. We can access everything from Workbench from within our automation. But external actions are very useful nonetheless. So in this case, what if we wanted to send ourselves a notification for every update that we make to our feature service? One way we could do this is with an email external action. So if I select send an email, we have a template for setting that up. So if I'm using Outlook or Gmail, we also have template values to enter in here to make it even easier. All I'd have to do is enter my email address, password, as well as what I want to include in this email. But to save us time, I've actually already set up an automation with that email trigger set up. So we can go look at that. And I've even entered a little HTML formatted body here to contain information about our updates being sent from this directory to ArcGIS Online. I can validate it to make sure that it's still good. FME Server can connect to our inbox. I'll select apply. And once I start this automation, we can go back to our directory that we're watching and submit a new update. So I'm going to drop a new zip file containing a shapefile and its sidecar files. And we can pretty much assume that this file is going to get picked up right away with the very short polling interval that I've set up on our DirectoryWatch every 2 seconds. So I can head over to my inbox first and see if our notification worked, and it looks like it did. So here is our email notification that we set up in our FME Server Automation, just letting me know that a layer has been updated. And if I were to go over to our ArcGIS Online layer, we could probably see some new features that have been added here from our shapefile zip. So you can see, maybe you noticed before BC Place was missing, and now we have a new feature on our layer. And that was just added by that automation that we made in under a minute. So now we can see how we can use triggers, internal actions, and external actions to create a front-end workflow, connecting different applications, data, and formats together in an automated workflow. And keys are the last and final part of our need to know automations overview today, or at least the parts that I will be covering. Throughout our pizza story, a lot of communication has happened. An order was passed from the lizard to the restaurant. That order is then passed to the kitchen with the chefs. And then we have a driver that needs an address and payment information to deliver the final product. And in FME Server, we use keys to pass messages in between our automation components. So every trigger and action has its own properties that can be passed on to the next action. And triggers and actions also have parameters that can be set up to intake these key values. And the whole system is built on JSON format. So if you're familiar with JSON, this is going to be even more simple, but you don't have to know it in order to use keys. Once we connect a trigger and an action or two actions together on our automation canvas, keys are available to use in downstream parameters, and different actions will have different parameters. So if we use the run workspace action as an example, the parameters within that action may depend on the user parameters that were configured within the workspace. So for example, in our demo, we passed the DirectoryWatch file path into our run workspace action in order to use that shapefile in our workspace. Keys are definitely a topic worthy of more discussion time than we have today. So we've linked our webinar to automation keys on the bottom of this slide if you're interested in learning more about them. So this completes my part of the pizza story from client to server, back to client again. Now I'm going to pass it back to Holly to explain what happens when something goes wrong.
Great, thank you, Sanai. So that was an overview of all of the different components of automations and how they work with one another. But inevitably, when you're brand new to an application, or even if you've got a lot of experience, things can go wrong. So I wanted to walk you through some troubleshooting techniques before we conclude today's webinar. So what could go wrong? Well, when you're ordering a pizza, there are many things. Maybe you have a bad connection and your order doesn't go through, or an ingredient is out of stock, or you submitted the wrong information and they delivered your pizza to the wrong address, or maybe you received the wrong order, although in my experience, that's not always a bad thing because I have ended up with free pizza before. But the point is that something could go wrong at every single stage, and that applies to the automations workflow as well. It could be in a trigger or an action or something within the actual workspace translation. So to troubleshoot anything in FME, we have to turn to the log files. So you can think of the log files as the equivalent of the tracking feature when you place an online order. every automation in FME Server has a log that records the complete history of every event that is taking place. This includes any incoming messages received by a protocol, how frequently a service is polled, any errors attempting to connect to a configuration, or carry out any specific task in the workflow. Using the automations log can help narrow down where you should focus your troubleshooting efforts and identify whether there is an issue with the automation or with a specific job. So when a workspace is run on FME Server, this is what we refer to as a job. And no matter how the job is submitted, whether it's with an automation or otherwise, it will generate a log file as well. And this log captures all the messages generated by the components of the specific translation. And this should be near identical to the translation logs generated when you created and tested running a workspace in FME Desktop. And I will point out that if you publish a workspace to FME Server without testing it, then go back and run it on FME Desktop first. So for the most part, automation and job log files should be descriptive enough for you to identify what went wrong when setting up an automation, but occasionally you might need to log further information to fully diagnose the issue. So in this case, the log action, which is an internal action, is particularly helpful for troubleshooting because it allows you to route specific keys or event messages to the automation log to help you understand how information is being stored and passed between nodes. So in FME Workbench, you may have come across the logger transformer, and the log action is the FME Server Automations equivalent. So depending on whether you're troubleshooting an error within a job or within an automation component, either one may come in handy. So I've been following along with Sinai and creating my own automation, but I didn't receive an email. So now we're going to take a few minutes to look in my automation, go through some of these log files and try and figure out where I went wrong. So here I have my FME server, and actually I'm just going to zoom in a bit, as I know on my larger monitor sometimes it can be small in a screen share. And I'm going to go to my most recent automation. So here I have my DirectoryWatch, my workspace, and then sending an email as well. And to access an automations log file, all I need to do is go to the menu and view log file. And here you can see, hopefully it's big enough, that we've logged every message from the assembly of the automation to polling the directory and to sending any events. So I already went through the process of uploading a zip file to the directory that I'm watching, and it looks like my job did submit successfully here. However, it looks like the translation ran into an error. So my log is very short because I'm just testing. However, if you do have an automation that's been running for some time, this log file may span over a series of pages. So in that case, you can use these filters at the top to filter out for any errors or warnings to help track down any issues. So in this case, because the issue was to do with a job, I'm actually going to go and take a look at the job log to see if there's any more information that can help me diagnose the issue. So I'm going to jump back to my automation. And in the menu again, this time I can see all the jobs that this automation has triggered. It simply applies a filter on the jobs completed page. So from here, I can see that my last workspace to run did fail. And if I go and check it out, I have exactly the same things as were available through the automations log. So I can filter out any errors. So in this case, it looks like there was only one error printed in the log, but it's always important to go and check that job log if there was a failure with the job, because it could hold more information than what the automation has to offer. So here it looks like the shapefile has failed to open file for reading. So this is curious because I would expect to see a full file path here. So perhaps there's an issue with the entry into my published parameter within my workspace node on the canvas. So let's take a look back over to my automation and see what I've got set up here. So if I go and view my building updates, it looks like I set my shapefile to my file root name, and perhaps that's not the right key to use. But what I can do is I'm going to add a log action here, and I'm going to log all of the keys from the DirectoryWatch just to double check which one I should be using downstream. So I'm going to disable my workspace at this point because I don't want to run it when I know that it's going to fail. And then I'm going to update this to a log a message. And I'm going to log all of my keys from my directory. So my file action, my file path, and my file root name. And this will help me determine what information I should be passing downstream. So now I'm going to go and drop a file back into that directory again. And in a moment, we should see that this information has been logged. So I can view my complete log file here, and I can filter just for messages coming from the log action. And you can see here that I now have all three of my keys logged. So it looks like actually the key that I need to be using in this case is the full file path. So this is a fairly simple example, but just to demonstrate how you can make use of the log action to determine what information you're actually passing through to the remainder of your downstream actions. So now I can go back, remove my log action since I've determined the cause of the issue, update my workspace to use the file path instead, enable the workspace, and start it. And this time, if I were to trigger it again, let's see if I have some additional files that I can use. Let's see. I might have to remove one of these first and then reload it again. I didn't prepare any more zip files. So now what I can do is move this back into here. And this is because I'm only monitoring for create, which is why I need to remove it first. And we should see that this workspace will be triggered successfully and also run an email. Well, I'll also receive an email. And when you're doing a live demo, a few seconds always seems like a long time. There we go. So here you can see that my job was submitted. And this time my translation was successful. And I have received an email containing my updates. Okay, so that was a very quick overview of troubleshooting and the fundamentals to working with automations in FME Server. So we hope that you found this information valuable and are now thinking what else you need to know. I promise that's the last time that I'll use that pun. Automations has many advanced capabilities to enable you to orchestrate more complex enterprise integration tasks. So on this slide, I've just linked some resources that I'll ask Elizabeth to send out in the chat. And we're also just going to conduct another poll, as we'd love to hear from you what automations webinar you'd like us to cook up for you next.
All right, and we'll give everyone a few moments here to place their entries. Okay, maybe about 10 more seconds to get your poll response in. Okay, and it looks like the majority have voted now, so I'll close out the poll here and share the results.
Okay, well, Sanai, it looks like we've got our work cut out for us, because we are doing at least 3 more webinars on automations.
Sounds like a series. I wonder what food we'll pick for our next analogy. Maybe we'll just keep talking about pizza.
Okay, so what we wanted to do was leave you with a couple of further resources, because the purpose of this webinar was really to explain the different components that make up automations. So we want to leave you with the tools to actually go away and be able to do this yourself as well. So here we've highlighted a chapter from our FME training platform, as well as an extensive tutorial series from our community. And these both contain step-by-step instructions for working with different triggers, as well as internal and external actions. So if this webinar sparked your interest, then we highly encourage you to go and check out these resources. So if you haven't already signed up for the FME Academy, then you will need to make an account to access that training material, but it is free. And you can also download FME Server today and use it with a free trial as well. So we hope you haven't found this webinar too cheesy. Before we have a Q&A session, I'll just hand over to Elizabeth to go over a couple of wrap-up slides.
Awesome, thanks, Holly. So our first one here is Gartner Peer Insights, if you're able to switch to the next slide there.
Yep.
So we'd really appreciate it if you do have time to share your experience with FME. I've just dropped a link in the chat to contribute a review there. And also, as a thank you for joining us today, we do have a community badge that you can redeem. So I will drop the code for that in the chat here. If you're not a part of the FME community, we highly encourage you to check that out. A lot of great resources and forums within the community as well. And our FME UC. So this is coming August 24th to 26th. If you have yet to register, there's still early bird savings. So would highly encourage you to check that out. It's going to be an absolute hoot. I know all of us safers are really looking forward to the conference. And check out other upcoming and on-demand webinars at safe.com/webinars. Lots of great content coming up and resources there as well. And with that, it does look like we have about 15 minutes here for some Q&A. So if you have yet to drop your questions in the chat, in the question panel there, please do so as you think of them. And I'll pass it over to our presenters. Any interesting questions we may want to highlight here to start with?
Turn my camera on and say hello to everyone again. Just having a quick look through the questions. So we'll see if there's any that we can raise. Sanai, have you seen any that spark your interest to address?
Not yet, but I just want to tell everyone I really appreciate all the pizza puns. They're contributing discussions about pizza. I'm happy to chat about that as well.
There was one that was, instead of skip the dishes, it's skip the workload, which I thought was very relevant to automations. And I can't believe we missed it. Okay,
all
so
I know is definitely ordering pizza tonight.
Yeah. Yeah. So one great question that we have here is, does the DirectoryWatch take up engine resources whenever it's polling for that file? So I'm going to broaden this question and address it in the sense of all triggers and also external actions. So all of those processes are core processes. So that means that they do not occupy any engine resources to be able to run those.
Absolutely. And just a really quick question I see here, is FME compatible with AutoCAD? It absolutely is. And we have so many great resources for using AutoCAD with FME, including, I'm sure, some great webinars that we've put on. I'll drop a couple links in the chat for anyone interested in learning more about that integration.
Okay, yeah, if you do have any other questions about automations, then please feel free to send them in. It looks like the majority of the question panel is just either people saying that they want pizza or talking about pizza-related fun. So hopefully you took something away from this webinar other than pizza. But
Is FME Server, can you use it without FME Desktop? No, you do need FME Desktop and Workbench as a foundation to begin using FME Server. Those workspaces that you create in Desktop are what we use to do all the data transformations on Server.
Natalie's asking if there's a CAD webinar coming up. Yes, we do have a CAD and GIS webinar coming up in May, I believe May 11th. So yeah, check that out, safe.com/webinars, and you can register for that.
So there's one comment here regarding API calls for automation. We do have an external action, the HTTP request, that does support the ability to make requests to API calls. So if there's something specific that you're looking for within that external action, then please share it through the comments and we can pass that feedback onto our development team as well.
Someone's just asking if, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Someone's just asking if old school notifications are going to become incompatible with FME Server. You don't have to worry about that for now. If you're on the notifications train, that's fine. They're not going anywhere that I know of or have heard of, but that's no stopping you from trying out automations as they are now, because you can use both at the same time and maybe you'll find you like them better.
Yeah, definitely notifications is not going anywhere, but if you're making new workflows, then we would encourage you to use automations. Because notifications is legacy, although it is still in the product, it's not something that we are actively kind of maintaining. So if you encounter any issues when you're trying to set those up, then we would encourage you to be moving over to automations. Okay. There's a question about receiving an email to trigger a workbench in FME Server. So for email, there are two different options. FME Server does have an inbuilt mailing server that you are able to receive emails from. You're not able to send using FME Server's mail server, but you can receive emails. And to make use of that system, your FME server does have to be publicly resolvable so that your mail provider can find FME server's mail server. And then the second option is for you to set up, similar to the DirectoryWatch, an external mail server and then have FME frequently poll that account for new emails or unread emails. And similar to the DirectoryWatch, there is a key for email attachments, as well as the email body, subject, email sender address, And so all of that information can then be passed downstream using those keys as well. Okay. So there is a question about licensing. Elizabeth, maybe you could dig up our pricing page and share that out in the chat. FME Desktop and FME Server are separate applications, so they do have different licensing models. If you're looking to purchase a lot, then you might consider one of our subscription programs instead. But if you want to have a conversation about pricing, then we definitely encourage you to reach out to info@safe.com, and then we can connect you with the appropriate account manager to have a further conversation around that.
Awesome, and I did just drop the link into the chat, safe.com/pricing.
Fantastic.
All right, any other questions we may want to address before we wrap things up here?
Yeah, just having a look, there's a couple coming through still. So one question is, are there any references you can direct me to prepare a workspace to use in FME Server Automations? I would encourage you to check out the Getting Started with Automations article series, and there's one specifically on the Automations Writer, which I think would be really helpful. The only other thing to really consider is you want to be using published parameters, because in FME Server you can't make modifications to the workspace itself. Any information that you want to send into the workspace has to be accessible through a published parameter.
Just dropped that tutorial into the chat for anyone interested in following along, learning more about the Automations Writer.
So I'm going to try and dig up some resources. There's another question here about deployment of FME Server and best practices. So I'm just going, we do have a great article on best practices for FME Server administrators. So I'll just see if I can find that. So I just added that into the chat as well. Okay, so it looks like there's a question about Azure Grid. Sanai, have you ever used that format before in Automations?
I actually haven't, but I know others on our team have. It's not something I've gotten to explore yet.
No.
I'll see if we have an article or tutorial, something that touches on that, and share it with the chat if I can find something.
Awesome. Okay.
Thanks,
Sanai. There's another question here. Let's say I want to send an email if an action goes wrong and I have 5 actions in my automation. Do I need to create an email action, external action for every action, or is there a way to use a single email for sending emails for all of these 5 actions? So if you want the same email subject and email body, then you can certainly link up the failure port of all 5 of those actions to a single email. However, if you wanted to modify something that couldn't be controlled by a key coming out of that workspace, then you would need to create separate email actions for those events. Okay, so there is a question about using FME Cloud instead of FME Server. And some users turn to FME Cloud purely because of maintenance, because essentially all that you're doing is spinning up an instance rather than having to go through the entire deployment process yourself. And also because you're hosted on FME Cloud, then you do tend to see a reduced costs because you're only paying for the amount of time that that instance is running. So you can shut it down overnight and things like that. But FME Cloud does have some limitations. It is deployed over a Linux platform. So if you are using any formats that are reliant on Windows, then FME Cloud wouldn't be an option for you in that case.
I'm seeing a question. It's more on the Workspace app topic, which is our self-serve capability in FME Server to build a little web application for end users to use. But it's a good question, and it could apply to automations as well. Basically, they have a client that uploads files that server is processing, and then they find that the files are being deleted after a day on FME Server. They're asking, is there a way to move these uploaded files to a different folder to retain them? I'd suggest either you have a few options here. You can modify the workspace so that that file is saved somewhere specific that's not cleaned up. But if you just want to be moving certain files between folders on your system, I highly recommend a demo that we did not too long ago called Tasks Your Business Should Automate in 2022 that just makes sense. We did that one earlier in the year, and Mark does a demo on how to set up a file archive workflow for moving files between your network folders or within server, and it's really awesome, and it sounds like it would apply to this scenario. And you get to use and try out automations to do some housekeeping as well. So I'll share that webinar in the chat for you, as well as the name of the demo that shows how to do that.
I beat you to sharing it in the chat, Sinai.
Yes, oh, perfect. Thanks, Elizabeth, you beat me to it. Yeah, awesome.
Okay, there was just one other question I see here that I'd like to answer. I think it's a really good question about whether you can trigger FME automations through the API. So FME Server has a manual trigger, and the manual trigger does have an API endpoint. So if you are looking to trigger an automation workflow through a different application or program or script, then you can make use of the manual trigger to do that and the correlating API endpoint for that.
Awesome. And was that the last one we're thinking?
Yeah, I think we're about at time. There are quite a few questions. So if we did miss one, then we'll definitely try and follow up with you afterwards as well.
Yeah, lots of great questions today. Thanks, everyone.
Excellent. Yeah, and so if you do have any other questions you think of, we will hang around for a couple minutes here yet, and also an opportunity for you to save out any links from the chat. And we'll also be sure to send out the slides later today, as well as with the recording, in case you want to browse through those again. And with that, a big thank you to our two wonderful presenters here today and to our audience as well. If you do have a moment to fill out the webinar survey, any feedback helps us improve our program, so we would really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time, and enjoy your pizza this evening if you get into those cravings.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.
Bye.